Recording in progress.
Hello, everyone out there listening, because that's all you can do with this. It's an audio medium. Glad to have everyone inviting us back into their ears and their lives and your commutes and your dishwashing, whatever it is you're doing. We're here with you today. This is Dwight with The Broken Brain, your weekly look at psychology and culture. Very, very excited today to highlight I guess, not to be overly simplistic, but a very good book. I'm just going to start with good because it's quite good. I'm talking to Rosie Schaap, the author of The Slow Road North, How I Found Peace in an Improbable Country, which is a creative nonfiction, let's put it in there, memoir. I think it would fit in that genre. Is that a good genre to put it in?
Sure.
Well, Rosie is an author of the book Drinking with Men, a memoir, and also Becoming a Sommelier. You're a columnist for the New York Times. I know that you're a creative writing teacher as well. There's a whole bunch of things you've written for Food and Wine. You've been on This American Life featured, and there's a whole bunch of stuff your publisher was kind enough to share with me. And the greatest thing of all, which got me to know who you were, was this wonderful book about your life and your experiences. We'll get into all of what those are. And so, Rosie, thank you so much for joining today. Really excited to talk to you.
Right. Thank you so much. And thank you to your listeners. It's great to be here on the airwaves with you.
Well, tell everybody a little bit about yourself. We can start out with that. There's a lot of yourself, obviously. This is, and one of the things about this book that I love is that it's very, very, it goes really deep into not just the event, some very, very intimate events of your life, but also you don't hold back very much from at all from the experiences internally as well, which I think is very, very powerful as well. So, but yeah, tell everybody a little bit about who you are, and we'll get into this story that you're telling.
I feel I should say it was really interesting and exciting to be invited on a psychology-oriented program, and I had a feeling that a lot of this interior stuff that happens in the book, processing grief and guilt and all kinds of emotions, probably had something to do with that. But as you said, we'll get into that stuff. Your introduction was great. The publisher prepped you well. What else can I say about myself? I'm a native New Yorker, born and bred, but I've lived in this little village called Glenarm on the coast of County Antrim in Northern Ireland since 2019. And the book centers on that big move and how moving here, this dramatic shift in location and way of life was really a response to loss and grief.
That's what it really, really drops you in. You start in the book really at the bedside of your husband, Frank, is where we are with you and him in the hospital. I love how, by the way, you really you bring us into the story, and you guys are there reading a poem together, and it kind of outlays all the things around you that are going on, and we're invited into this very intimate moment that you guys are having very, very close. If I remember the chain of events, the day that he passed away, right?
Well, the reading of the poem was the day before. Frank died on the 15th of February in 2010, and on Valentine's Day, I was with him in hospice, and we had a tradition of reading this poem to each other. I know it sounds very, very corny, but I recommend it. It's a poem by Chaucer called The Parliament of Fowls. And some people say that the whole idea of Valentine's Day as a romantic holiday started in this poem. I don't know if that's true or not, but he was an English professor, and I'm a writer and a reader, and we met when we were both teaching English. So that's the kind of corny thing a couple people who love books will do.
Corny a lot of times is our word for things that are healthy that we're worried other people might think they're silly.
You know what? I agree with you. This is probably a whole other thread, but at a certain point, sentimental became a bad word. And I don't mind a little sentimentality at all. Some occasions call for it.
I think so too. In fact, I think there's kind of a hunger for it. I have noticed in little trends with media, with books and
Mhm.
movies that have been coming out over the last several years. I feel like there's sort of a call to sincerity, and I see that, and it's so interesting for me to see reviews where people are saying like, I went into whatever it is. We've got musicals coming back and things. And what are those if not sort of like glammy sentimentality and
I
whatever?
grew up on them. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
always love them.
And so if someone says, boy, I went into Wonka wanting to just, say it was dumb, and then I just sat like a child enraptured the entire time or something, you get people
Right?
almost hesitant to admit that it's like, oh, all this sentimentality. It's exactly what I needed, and kind of a thing. So I think there is a call for that these days.
I think you're right. I agree. There's one of my favorite living novelists, the wonderful Polish writer Olga Tokarczuk. She wrote Flights, among other books. When she won the Nobel Prize in Literature a few years ago, she delivered this beautiful talk called The Tender Narrator, sort of calling for more tenderness. And I think, when you say sincerity, I think tenderness is very similar, just a kind of opening up and putting your heart on your sleeve a little.
Yeah.
And I welcome that.
Well, that's very much what I see in here. One of the things I'll say, and I'll just hit this now. I think that one of the great things is as you go through in this story of kind of your journey, not just to healing, but literally the reason why you're now living in Ireland, and all of those steps along the way. One of the things that hit me pretty early in. And I've talked with a couple of authors who've come on talking about their own sort of like inspirations and stories and things have come on. I always appreciate one that kind of, shows that it's hard. Let me put it that way. For example, you make mention throughout the story of some of the financial difficulties with making some of these big changes in your life. And those get either omitted or sometimes the storytellers that write things like memoirs sometimes, well, let me put it this way. They either leave them out or they don't have to worry about them. I don't know which one it is, but those things tend to turn me off sometimes because I know how they come across. Like, I just needed to go and explore the world for 16 years or something like that. And I'm not trying to make fun of anyone in particular. I'll let everyone fill in the blanks with their own favorite thing that they think is pretentious, I guess. But so not trying to hone in and pick on anyone, but I really appreciate the reality of like, I was going through this huge journey and I had bills to pay. It's like, yeah, okay, I get that. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's on my mind a lot. I wish it weren't. I'm actually working on a book proposal that has a lot to do with money and personal debt and the emotional and ethical and other consequences. So it's something important to me. Part of me, wishes I could say, oh, I wish I were a writer with a giant trust fund and could just go anywhere I want at any time. I'm not that person. I mean, I certainly consider myself very privileged in most respects, so I want to make that clear. Um, but yeah, some people have read it and said, "Oh, it was very brave of you to do that." And I say, "Thanks," but it was as irresponsible in some ways as it might have been brave. This is something I'm constantly working on. I didn't grow up learning anything about personal finance, about money. I can barely do my times tables here at age 53. Numbers, and I have issues.
Some of us
But I
gravitate to soft sciences for a reason. I'm there with you.
right. Or as I always say, I
Arts,
could.
you know.
I could always do bartender math. In my many years as a bartender, I think I only gave the incorrect change once. But yeah, I felt it was important to be transparent about that. Um,
Well, there's a fine line between this idea of sort of reckless risk taking and courage, right? When people, when we talk about stories, it's usually the ones that like, oh, that went well, it was courageous. That didn't go well, I guess it was foolish. And in reality, it's like actual stories. And this is one thing I love about yours is that real stories don't have like oh, that was well, that was good. There's no such thing as knowing what would happen if we don't do something. Or if we do something different. So
yeah.
I don't know. And when you're plunged into some of the experiences you were having, obviously there's a certain amount of courage you had to take, even to just, did you profile this, I think, well in the book with grief? Grief requires a certain amount of courage to just get up each day.
Isn't it something? I mean, when we talk sometimes about finding something universal that all of our readers can sort of relate to, I mean, grief, I think, is one of those things. I don't have many friends in my age group who still have both their parents. A couple do, but not that many anymore. And we've all lost someone. And we all know how much that hurts. But it is shocking to me, Dwight, no matter how often we might go through it and lose those we love, it's still incapacitating each time. You still just hit this hard, hard wall, or at least I do. I shouldn't generalize, but I think I think it's unquestionably very hard for everyone to go through and try to go through our daily motions in life.
It's
Um,
so, yeah, it's so heavy because it's one of those things where if you've experienced it, you still haven't experienced it with that next occasion for grief. In other words, may have lost people, but I haven't lost this person yet until I
right,
do. Yeah.
right.
Oh. So with I tell everybody a little bit about the progression of that experience. And once again, I was going to say you chose to open with the loss of Frank when he passed, but you also pepper throughout the story a lot of other things from your own past, your shared journey, as well as your childhood and things that really come in there. Maybe that might be a good question to ask: is how come you chose to start it there when he died?
Well, that is a good question. I felt
Yes.
I had to. Yeah, no, they're all good. They're all good. Uh, I felt I had to. I mean, that was sort of, it wasn't the first really momentous loss in my life. I'd say that was my father about a decade before that. Um, but it was he was so young. He was 42, as I say in the book, and he badly wanted to keep living. And I'm not an optimist by nature. I often say pessimism is my shield. But while he was being optimistic in the face of a very rare, very deadly cancer that normally has a 2-year trajectory from diagnosis to death, how could I not at least try to rally to be optimistic with him? If he was still teaching, in a hospice bed the day before he died, how could I not sort of try at least to share in some kind of hopefulness? Where I think, the other people I'd lost before, um, I think there was a greater acceptance because they were older. It didn't feel anomalous. But he was so young and there was so much he still wanted to do. And I always felt I wanted to write about him. He was a writer too, and I felt he didn't get the chance to tell his own story. So the first thing I wrote was that first chapter, and I wrote it a long time ago. Before I moved over here, it was sort of the springboard for everything else. And one thing I talk about is how early in my experiences of visiting Ireland, I was a little possessive of it. Like, Ireland is mine. Frank and I traveled together, but we never came to Ireland. And he would have loved it here as a man who loves literature. For so many reasons, he would have loved it. So it's true, like, in that chapter when he finally falls asleep in hospice, this was we were watching the Winter Olympics of 2010. My mind starts wandering all over, and it wandered on over back to Ireland, and there we were.
That was something even at the time that was, although not to the extent of where you knew it was, or you didn't know where it was going to go in your life.
Oh no, no. The Glenarm, I wouldn't have even heard of this place for many more years. So not even an inkling of it yet.
If you don't mind, I wanted to read I made just a couple little notes about this. There's a quote from, this is when you started to travel and you had some experiences, and it just kind of cued me there as you were saying he didn't ever get the chance to write about himself and his life. So there's a quote here from your book. It says, for the first time since he died, but not the last, I felt that somehow I was, if not quite living his life for him, having experiences that he should have had instead. It's a kind of magical thinking to which the loss of a loved one extends itself, while the loved one is somewhere, nowhere, dead, not alive, an absentia. His survivor becomes his proxy, understudy, and sometimes maybe usurper. That's I wanted to ask you about that that's why I put it aside. But as you put it, you're writing something that maybe he would have written eventually. You're going places where maybe he would have gone eventually, and all of those kinds of things. I wonder if you could elaborate on the feeling behind that.
It was this very uncanny, unsettling feeling. Frank, as I also discuss in the book, he was a great cook and a great connoisseur of fine dining and wine and cocktails. And then somehow I wound up being the one writing a cocktail column for 5 years for the New York Times Magazine. It just didn't seem fair. The only chance Frank really got to write about himself a little bit, mostly he wrote literary criticism. I had bought him the gift of a food writing course a few years before he died, and he had started doing that. And it was never something I'd thought about doing myself. I was like, this is his thing. And lo and behold, just a few years later, I sort of emerged somehow as a so-called food and drink writer. So, that was just so strange to me. And sometimes I felt, oh, he'd be really proud, and maybe he's responsible in some magical, non-scientific way that I can't describe. Sure. Maybe like I get to do this stuff because he wants me to. And then there were these other times I thought, maybe he wants me to do this stuff, but for me to know that it's not going to make me happy anyway because he's dead. So conflicting, a real tangle of emotions, of warm feelings coming from my thoughts of him, and colder ones too. And he was a very sweet man. He really was. He was a gentle, kind person. But I think, they're also, I don't want to give too much away about the book, but early on, I give a reason why he might have felt angry with me. And that haunted me for a very, very long time.
That's something that I appreciated, was once again going back with that. See, sincerity is not just, oh, nice. It's like, no, it's sincerity is the whole picture, right? And talking about that, I think to kind of show that aspect of things, particularly when things don't have an easy, it's not like, you don't get an email from a deceased loved one that says, hey, by the way, this is fine now. Oh, thanks. I was glad. If we did, it wouldn't quite be so jarring when people do pass. And I don't mean to be silly about it, but
you're not.
There's that lack of closure that when we seek after what we often like in therapy and stuff, we talk a lot about the idea of closure. And I think that closure, the very difficult thing about closure is that it is most often an illusion kind of a thing.
I agree. Yeah.
It's more coming to terms with, I live with this feeling. What do I do? And how does it fit into my life?
Right. I agree.
Yeah.
I wince a little bit when people mention closure because I can't quite wrap my head around what exactly that would feel like. But I think, what you're saying, like, how do we learn to live with these feelings and continue our lives? That's the issue. This will never be closed. I will never stop thinking about the people I love who aren't here anymore.
It's just it's such a vague term, which there's so many people who listen to this podcast know. There's many of those that happen in the therapy world. They get thrown around, and it's like we don't really know what the hell it means when we really break that down and say, well, what does that actually mean? And I fear that it becomes just a word that we know of something we're supposed to have, but for some reason I'm not strong enough, smart enough, fill in the blank enough to actually get it because I'm still having this hard time. Instead of saying, no, maybe some things don't ever close.
Right.
We just try to work with them. They just try to fit them into our life as something that's now part of us. Now, I was curious. You said, what has that kind of been like for you, or what is your? You kind of shaped this in the story, I guess. When it comes to living with these things, when it comes to, you mentioned just a second ago of saying feeling haunted or feeling, something weighing. Do you find that those things shift over time? What is that kind of grief healing or recovery like for you?
Oh yeah, I feel in my experiences, it definitely softens over time. That initial jolt of pain that can seem absolutely unsurmountable in the early days, I have found it does soften. The edges start to curve a little bit more. But one thing about coming to Ireland, I don't want to make it sound like all of the US is bad at grieving. I don't think that's true. I mean, if you've ever seen a New Orleans second line, that some people really, have an extraordinary way of dealing with grief. But I do find, and I say this in the book, that whatever else we Americans may or may not be, there is a kind of revelation of our Puritan roots in the way we often turn away from death. Mm-hmm. And Ireland is very different. I think it's, and I don't say as much of this in the book as I might have. I know I mention it, but I think that the legacy of the enormous catastrophic famine here in the 19th century, it's still sort of part of the DNA and the collective consciousness here. Certainly where I live in the North, the 30 years of deadly conflict known as the Troubles is very much still present in certain ways. And, it's almost impossible to look away from it here. And that may be very painful in some ways. But for me, and I think a lot of people here, it creates something that feels much healthier. Like, I'm going to look you in your eyes when you talk about your dead husband. Mm-hmm. I'm going to look you in the eyes. I'm going to ask questions. I might hold your hand. And we're going to talk about it, which I found so helpful for me.
I was struck by how many of those interactions came from people who were strangers at the time when that interaction happened. When you tell that story.
Yeah. No, I just found a very different attitude, which isn't to say I want to romanticize the Irish approach to death and bereavement. Nobody's perfect. People here have had their own challenges with it, certainly. Sure. But there is a quality of feeling feeling that people let it be present in everyday life and conversation that I hadn't felt in New York.
Well, it highlights something that I think is very important, and I think this applies to grief as well as to healing and trauma, and for that matter, really anything complicated, relationships, whatever. If we find the thing that is clicking for us, the system that works for us, the people that work for us, the community that works for us. One of the biggest obstacles to healing, I think, is that we don't allow ourselves to identify and accept that this is for me. This is what it will be for me. And in this case, it requires some pretty dramatic decisions for you to say, this is what's healing for me. And so to go through and jump through those hoops of saying, let me get to there, you kind of have to accept, like, okay, this may be something, maybe, in fact, not even may, it's not even a theory. I read about how you got feedback like this, right? That in people may be like, don't do that. This is not what people do. Right. And
Right.
you showcase that a lot by the reaction, very, very reasonable reaction people have to saying, you're never going to get that apartment again. What are you doing? You're just giving it up. You're actually leaving. It's like burning a bridge. But
So
yet,
New York.
for anyone who knows New York, right, that's even more epic than burning a bridge, is saying letting go of a lease, right?
Yeah.
A long time lease you've held.
Yeah.
And so to be able to push ourselves through that and say, this is for me, I'm going to embrace it. I think that's what I need to do. And finding what's right, whether it is Ireland or whether it is whatever it is, for people to embrace what they need to. It's very, very important, but yet we don't always do it because it can be very scary. And people sometimes try to talk us out of it.
Yeah. And it certainly didn't happen overnight for me. Frank died in 2010. My mother died uh, a year and 13 days later in 2011. And I didn't move here till 2019. So, yeah, certainly not instant. I couldn't just leap into it and across the ocean. I had to really think about it and plan and make difficult decisions. It's a lot to leave behind. There was definitely stuff I wanted to leave behind, but also things I really didn't. But I felt, 9 years after Frank's death, 8 years after my mom's, if I didn't make that leap then, it just probably wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. What kinds of things came with you that you didn't expect?
What kinds of things came with me? I would say the usual everyday anxieties. Uh, worry about people in my life, worries, as we discussed, about finances, worries about work. Freelance life is precarious. Anxiety, I know it dogs many of us, and I'm certainly among that company. Depression also, knowing what you do. In addition to this program, besides, I'm from New York, therapy is ingrained. I have no reservations about talking about it. Depression. These things don't just, and of course, grief doesn't leave you either. When these things do come with you.
Absolutely.
But it is stunning to me what a change of scenery, a change of tempo. I mean, the tempo in little tiny Glenarm is pretty different from the tempo in New York City. And a change of people you see every day. It really makes a difference.
It is finding what it is to kind of shake up the dynamic that you're having. It occurs to me as well that not only are you carrying obviously whatever struggles we have and things with us, when you go to a whole new culture, and I think we're already better traveled than I am by that point in your life when you were contemplating this. But I look at that and saying, like, well, at the same time, I'm also changing a whole system of how to do things. Like, I wouldn't know how do I find a new therapist in a little town in Ireland or something.
It's not easy.
I just thought of that as you said that with therapy. I was like, oh yeah,
right,
there's one thing.
Right.
Or even going to the dentist or something, it happens, I'm sure, but it's like, how do they do that? I don't even know what trash day is like or whatever. Just even those little things, right? To change.
Oh yeah. No, it's a lot of stuff after living in the same apartment for 23 years in Brooklyn. Yeah, it was a lot. But, when I finally, did it and came over here in 2019, I wasn't sure how long I'd be here. I thought it would probably be a year and a half. I had an 18-month visa. And, this really shows you how things have changed and time has passed. My dream was that I'd be here a year. I'd finish the master's course I was doing in Belfast, And then I'd maybe go see some friends in Sweden and then go to Finland and then end my trip in Russia, which obviously is not something I'd be doing right now.
A little change there.
So
Right?
yeah, so I didn't really have a big, sort of future-minded plan getting here. And I don't want to say anything good about COVID because it made a mess of all of our lives and everything. But it is possible that, were it not for the pandemic, I might have only been here a year or a year and a half,
I
that changed a lot of things.
I wonder, and you can share whichever you want to share, whichever you want to save for people to get into the book. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about. I thought you had a beautiful description of the time during COVID, with the particularly Stan the bird stood out to me as a very important character in this story.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, it was another it was strange. I mean, it was a strange time for everybody, of course, but I felt so lucky to be in this quiet little village where I could, walk off into a forest and not see anybody, or early enough take a walk by the sea, and feel quite safe. Of course, COVID came to Glenarm like it came to every place. Um, but I mean, for me and Mark, who was my partner then, my husband now. Oh, spoiler, but it's okay.
Worked out, everybody. No.
Yeah. For us, I mean, we felt very lucky to be, and it was an unusually beautiful springtime here. It was shockingly sunny. Sun is not a thing we get tons of over here. It was shockingly sunny and pleasant. And we just became entranced with our backyard birds. But as you said, especially this one bird, a very scrappy looking robin, I should say, the European robin is a totally different species from the robins you get in North America. They're cuter, but their eggs aren't as beautiful. So it's kind of a trade-off.
Kind of a trade-off. They each get a little bit. So this is one image I loved as well. Incidentally, is Mark. You mentioned he had this big bird watching guide that he's on the counter when he brought.
Yes,
the imagery for anybody out there, if you're still for some reason not sure if you want to read this, it's the imagery and the way that you engage with the senses is very, very. But go ahead, go back to Stan. I didn't mean to distract.
Yeah, no, Stan was just like, robins are known to be not very sociable in a nice way with other birds, but unusually sociable with humans. And, Stan knew we liked him. He knew we wanted him around. He was a bully to all the other birds, but he charmed both of us. And, for me, I talk about how this was certainly connected to my favorite childhood book, Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden, a book I still love, where a robin sort of shows the way to healing, by showing the way to the garden. And it amazed me that I was having an experience, Dwight, with a bird. I was having this thing with this little wild creature. And it was, and listen, I'm not one of these people who's like, I don't watch TV. I love TV. But honestly, standing at my big kitchen window watching the birds, it was like the best TV. Never a dull moment. And then I learned about how deep over here the connections, which I hadn't been aware of, between robins and death are. And that kind of amplified the meaning or meaningfulness of all of it.
One of the things that I liked is the sense of community that you mention as well, that you had this whole new. And once again, you really give both sides of it. The jarring nature of being like, I'm in this place. I don't know what to do when I get these weirdos banging on my door in the middle of the night with the local kids and their pranks. But then, and then learning how to engage with that. But in fact, if you don't mind, by the way, I should be asking your permission if I'm reading sections of your book. Do you mind if I read that?
No, listen, when you read the first section, I was like, I should have brought you on for audiobook. You're doing a great job.
Wow.
Please, by all means. Thank you.
My audition reel. Let's see. Okay, so here we go. This actually comes from a part where you were talking about starting to take, you participated in helping with integrating the schools. And I guess I should add, as you put in there, that integrating the school in the town has much more to do with Protestant Catholic kind of separations than it does anything racially, like it would in the history of the U.S. But so you had been participating in that, and then it says this here. Community in its most precious and uncynical form does live here, and because I live here too, I'm a part of it. I played the smallest role in the integration process. I went to meetings, I signed petitions, and I wrote letters. But I felt I had at least done something to help the village not only survive, but heal, and I felt that I was healing too. And I was curious about the role that that's played for you, the community, and integrating into that.
Oh, it's tremendous here, and as I write about in the book, the word community is kind of slippery here in Northern Ireland. It's used euphemistically when someone doesn't want to say Catholics or Protestants. It's that community or that community, and it often has this kind of strange charge to it. But in this little tiny village, which I probably should say is um, demographically unusual here. It's about as close to 50-50 Protestant and Catholic as you'll find, certainly in this county and probably in all of Northern Ireland. Community is kind of everything. Um, you know, uh, I tell the story of the village's decline, from this very prosperous place, I'd say before the 70s, 80s, to a place with very little commerce. And I mean, it's still wonderful. I obviously love it, but it's very different from what it was. It felt certain that if they lost the school, which very likely would have happened had it not gone through this integration process, I mean, that would be disastrous for the village. I certainly played the very smallest role possible in this plan. It was really a remarkable teacher who led the charge, who grew up in the village herself, but then traveled the world and came back to teach at the same school she'd gone to. Some of my closest friends became a fabulous octogenarian couple in the village who'd gone to that school a long time ago. And just really seeing how many people felt so strongly that one of the best ways forward here is to bring kids of these different faith traditions and of no faith tradition at all, together. If you really want to heal, I think understanding is part of it. And that's been slow to happen here in many ways. But I mean, other community things, people say, "Oh, you're from New York. Aren't you bored in Glenarm?" I'm like, "You haven't met my wildlife group." Or, can I tell you how cool it is to be in a book club with farmers, not just people who work in publishing? And people really do rally for each other here. Again, don't want to overstate or romanticize. I tell people, Glenarm is a beautiful place, a charming place, a community-oriented place, but it's also a very real place. And we know what that means, that entails.
Yeah.
Stuff too.
And I think it's no, exactly. It's a process of engaging with those that are around you. And the interesting thing is we all do. We all have community around us. It's like which ones. Certainly there's an element of what clicks for us, but there's also an element of saying discovery and investment. And that to me is a choice that you made to say, let me get involved. I'm here. This is my place as well. I have some ownership, accountability, attachment, and emotionality attached to the success of this place where I am, and it makes you part of that community. I've had become a friend. He's been on the show a couple of times. Maurice F. Martin, who's a substance abuse counselor and author. And it's interesting because when I first met him, I referred to his genre of trainings and his books as self-help, and he doesn't like that. He said, don't call it that. He's like, there's no such thing as self-help. There's realizing who is around you and building your team and your community. You can't heal by yourself. And I've always thought that's a very powerful thought,
Yeah.
And it seems to me your
Yeah.
story kind of talks a lot
Yeah.
about that, as the connectivity you have with people.
Right. I certainly couldn't have gotten through by myself, even all those years that were hard when I was still in New York. Of course,
Hmm.
I had my people there who were wonderful and supportive. But there's always been something about people in Ireland. I think as a native New Yorker, and and you and your listeners can hear it now. We talk. New Yorkers talk, and I think I felt at home quickly in Ireland when I first came here in my 20s, because there was no shyness about bumping into someone in the shop and say, oh, you're going to get the last loaf of bread. I see what you're up to, and having a laugh over it. Or,
Yeah.
oh, did you come all the way to Belfast to, buy a record or what, whatever. There's always the crack, as they say here. People engage with each other in a way I love. I mean, I've always yearned for community. I don't know if I've always had it. And I think that's part of where the yearning for it came from.
Sure.
But I could not imagine, I don't want to sound like a goody goody about it, because, the old sort of platitude that we get as much from volunteering as we give. It's true. It's totally true. So, I couldn't imagine not getting involved with other people and projects that are important, like
Yeah.
saving a village school.
Well, and I believe too that when it comes to traumatic and grief stricken experiences, one of the things that is healing, as you'd put it, there's a softening and we move through things. But
Hmm.
one of the ways I think that we really do heal is that we participate in the world around us. It's almost as if we say to ourselves, like, okay, you know what, the world's okay. I can still live here. There's joyful things, there's sad things, there's some things that are missing. If someone dies, they're missing, and they'll always be sad about that. But I can still go over here and help with the school. I can still go over here and find joy and love, and that's okay. And I think the feeling that it's okay that my life is moving on, it seems like that's a hard transition for everyone with grief, but it's very important,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. But what I was saying earlier about this kind of approach, that I often felt where I lived in the States, just kind of get on with your work. Um, you know, uh, there's that, but then there is, also a sort of later, um, I guess it would be fair to say, sort of Victorian idea. You think of Queen Victoria wearing black every day of her life, or the kind of mementos people made in the 19th, keeping locks of their loved one's hair and making
Yeah.
little necklaces and things with them. I think there is this push and pull. You must move on. You shouldn't move on. This kind
That's a
of
great, I'd never
thing.
heard it said that way. And that is a great description. And that is a hard place to be stuck in between.
Yeah, like get on with your life. Oh, but you still have to be sad.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so as much as community engagement in many different ways was always really important to me, um, I wasn't ready to get back to it for a while after Frank and my mom died.
Hmm.
There had been things I really loved doing that I just had to stop doing. And I just, like you were saying, at a certain point, just brushing your hair and taking a shower and, feels like an achievement, the thought of like going into a room full of people. And I couldn't do it for a long time, no matter how social I might be as a person. And I do enjoy other people a lot. I was on a kind of grief lockdown there
Yeah.
for a year or more.
Did you notice when you started to feel like it was okay to feel joy again? Did it sneak up on you, or was there any kind of events that were like, oh, I can be happy again? That's okay.
I mean, there were plenty. The timeline gets fuzzier and fuzzier because I know. I mean, certainly immediately after Frank died, there was a long stretch just in bed with the cats,
Yeah.
in bed with the cats. People bringing me soup, that kind of thing. Um, so in a way, in a way, the first sort of little burst of something that I recognized as quite special and helpful was a trip I took to New Mexico that spring to see a very dear old friend who I really loved. And I felt, what's a better change of scenery from New York than New Mexico? How nice will it be to see a desert sky and to be with, to be with people I love but haven't seen in a long time. And it was over Passover. And I'm not the most religious person in the world, but I love Passover. I mean, it's about community. You should invite strangers to your table. You should be taking people. So there I was with my old friend who happens to be enrolled in the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma. Her husband's side of the family, they're Michigan, Chippewa. There I was, the only Jew at the Passover table. And here were my friends indulging me with brisket with a lot of hatch chilies in it. So it was different. It was great. And it was just a wonderful moving time.
In a Manhattan restaurant, they would call that fusion. I think they would say.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it was great. But then you sort of flatline again. Like what I remember from that time is there would be a little burst of wonderful and then, a high and then just sort of level out again for a while.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful story and wonderfully told. And I will say that there's so much. I would just encourage everybody to go out and to find it and to read it. It's coming out right around where we are. Right around where we are at the 20th of August, which this is either some day or number of days right around that. I'm not 100% sure yet, but this episode will release. So not just because of the things we've talked about, but there's so many other stories that are wrapped up into this story that you're telling of relationships, of joy, of overcoming trauma and abuse, and just so much that you've offered and put out there for everyone. And I just want to say, I really appreciate you taking the time to write it and also the vulnerability, because this would make a great novel if you just pretended it was someone else, but you decided to just throw it out there and say, yeah, this is me. And I think that's a powerful vulnerability that speaks to people in a really good way. So I think it's going to do a lot of people a lot of good to be able to read this memoir.
Well, that means a lot to me. It's nice to hear someone say, thank you for writing this, but really thank you for reading. To me, it is like a constant wonderment that people are taking the time to read something I wrote. And I am always grateful for that. And if I can be a compassionate companion to other people going through their own grief, that would be the best thing I could ask for, having written this book.
Wonderful. I want to give everybody the information of where they can best find your book and everything. Before I do that, I always like to ask people for a little tip for all the listeners out there that just has to do with the ways of giving back to the community around them or to other people. It could be the name of a charity or a nonprofit that you appreciate or enjoy, or just a good sort of community practice that people could engage in to help them to give back. Do you have any insights or suggestions for the listeners about that?
Oh, there's so many things we can do. My favorite way to do fundraising for charities I love is to feed people. I
wanted to come over to some of the parties you were having when I was reading this. I was like, geez.
I love to feed people. So, last year around Hanukkah, I thought I'd raise, this may sound strange to people, but it made perfect sense to me. I'd raise some funds for Children's Prophet in Palestine by selling latkes that I made at Hanukkah. Yeah. And that meant a lot to me. And besides, latkes are news to most people in this part of the world. So
not a big, right. I got you. That makes sense.
But since you've given me the opportunity, I will mention one of my all-time favorite charities, which is Partners in Health, founded by the late, great Paul Farmer. And I think most of your listeners will be aware of how extraordinarily dire things have been in Haiti lately, but also for a very long time. And I think they do extraordinary work giving the best possible health care to the people who need it the most and can afford it the least.
Wonderful. No, that's a great one to mention, and we hadn't had anyone mention that one or that particular need, and I appreciate you sharing that, because that is something, as people are aware, it's always good then to think about what can we do. And as everybody's heard me like a broken record say this too, if you think, oh, what can I do? If I can only do sharing on social media, or if I can just give $1, or if I can just give $2, and then we say, no, then we just don't do it. Think about if 100,000 people didn't do the thing that you didn't do, or did do the thing that you can do. All of a sudden, that's 100,000 times whatever you did. Not to show off. I know we talked about math, but anyway, that's something important for people to remember.
Yes.
Let me give one quick just shout out for all the listeners out there too. Today, we're right up on it when this episode is going to come out. August 29th is a Thursday. We're having the third annual live feed for opioid overdose awareness. I'm going to be doing, it's about a 5-hour live feed with some guests and people coming on to talk about it. It's the third year running that we've been doing this here at the podcast, and the theme this year, like to take a different wrinkle each year, is relapse. Not only preventing relapse, but how to recover from it when it happens, and how it can play a role in people's health management that is not a death sentence, but is just a thing that happens, and how can we avoid it becoming tragic and more dangerous in this time, where we're taking that time to be aware of that. So if everybody would, you can go over to the website, dwighthurst.com/live, and you can see links there to watch or listen or to participate. There's a live call-in type of feature where there's a link there, very, very well labeled, so you don't click the wrong one, obviously. But if you want to watch it on social media, click one of the links. But if you want to join, there's a link. You just click right there, and you will be added to the StreamYard feed, and will be a welcome guest. And love to hear from everybody and participate in that. It's always been a good time, and it's an important thing to be aware of. So that's going to be Thursday, August 29th, midday. You can look up on the website there to see the different times for everybody. Rosie, thank you once again. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today. It's been, I always hope people are listening to the show, but I just enjoy meeting really cool people, and this has been one of those really cool conversations that I know is going to stay with me for a long time.
Well, I feel the same way, Dwight. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Courtemp Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Courtemp Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.